Former anti-vaxxers, what caused you to change your mind? I'll give you an historical one. In 1736 I lost one of my sons, a fine boy of 4 years old, by the smallpox, taken in the common way. I long regretted bitterly, and still regret that I had not given it to him by inoculation. This I mention for the sake of parents who omit that operation, on the supposition that they should never forgive themselves if a child died under it. My example showing that the regret may be the same either way and that, therefore, the safer should be chosen. Benjamin Franklin. My mum told me last week when we were talking about a COVID-19 vaccine that she nearly didn't have my brother and I vaccinated. I was shocked, because she was a nurse for years and years, and she now stresses the importance of getting our yearly flu vaccinations and pushes my needle-phobic dad to get his. Basically, when she was doing her nurse training back in the early 70s, she did a few weeks on the only ward in the country at the time for people with profound and multiple disabilities, PMLD. The majority were born with PMLD or had them as a result of oxygen deprivation at birth, but she was told that a handful of them developed them following vaccine injury. Not sure if this is a medically accepted term, but those are the words she used. From a single bad batch of vaccines for measles and rubella, I think. By the time my brother and I were born in 1988 and 1990, she was still affected by what she'd seen back in the 70s, and although she'd seen the progress in vaccinations and there were no more reports of these bad batches of vaccines, she didn't allow them to give us our first vaccine doses on time. It wasn't until my aunt, also a trained nurse, showed her the latest stats and research about vaccines that she reluctantly decided to have us vaccinated. I was 1 year old at the time and scheduled for the MMR jab. It was the Mr. vaccine that she was told caused these vaccine injuries, and she was very reluctant to go ahead with it, but ultimately agreed that both my brother, 2.5 at the time, needed to catch up on all our vaccines. She didn't take us to get them. She sent my dad instead, again, needle phobic, and he and I apparently cried the whole time. She told me that she'd glad she decided for us to get the vaccines as we've been mostly healthy since then, and if it hadn't been for our aunt we might not have ever been vaccinated. When I was in medical school, my pediatrics inpatient rotation had several children with very sad, confirmed, genetic disorders, but their parents said the diseases were due to vaccination, not genetics. It was wild. I was just a medical student, but I was pretty sure that a vaccination after birth won't cause genetic changes back in time to conception. I was a teenager and used to believe that if I got sick, my immune system would handle it and make me stronger. Like most youth, I believed I was invulnerable. I figured thousands of years of ancestors had survived without vaccines, and so could I. It was years before I realized that before vaccines, people didn't just heal the viruses away, most of them died or were crippled by illness their whole lives. My great-great-aunt got polio at the age of 16, about 1906, and was paralyzed from the waist down. She became wheelchair-bound, and wheelchairs back then looked like torture devices. She lived to 100 and died around 1990. I can't imagine 84 years of life in a wheelchair. She married, no kids, but how she kept her mind together I'll never know. Hard to say, but Redding, honestly, I was on the elderberry colloidal silver whatever natural balls flavor of the week in my late teens, early 20s. Could dig up some obscure study from the 1960s to support it. Well, flu shots aren't 100% effective. What's the point? Have you seen all the people who get sick from it, etc. etc. Simply put, I had bad advice from some of my father's vitamin shop, libertarian, naturopath, whatever friends. In grad school I took more statistics classes, keep reading about data analysis, started to learn what significant sample sizes meant, common logical and statistical fallacies, and, surprise, most anti-science nonsense doesn't hold up empirically at all. There's just no data to support it, and requires torturing of statistics and misrepresentation to defend their case. Luckily I don't have some epic story of a family member dying from a preventable disease, but it's still embarrassing to think back how arrogantly I was convinced I was more clever than the actual doctors and scientists. This is, in my mind, one of the reasons why we should switch statistics for calculus in high school, and to teach critical thinking and scientific reasoning much earlier in life. A lot of kids are not going to go to college. They need to learn the stuff when they are kids. I don't really know why I didn't like the idea of vaccines, but I didn't until my girlfriend had gotten pregnant, and then I stepped on a rusty nail. Like, the only way to stop tetanus is the vaccine. My now wife was an anti-vaxxer. I generally go with what she says most of the time because I cannot be bothered to argue. However, when we were discussing getting married and having kids, I was surprised at how strongly I felt about. I was prepared to walk away from the love of my life rather than not vaccinate. I gave all of the reasons. I'm from a third world country and she is European. I have seen too much crap from a lack of vaccination program to sit on the fence on this. She came around. When our first was born, he was quite ill. I don't think we were in danger of losing him, but just that tiny bit of danger reiterated the point of protecting them and others from illnesses. My wife is now more on top of the vaccination dates for our kids than I am. A friend of hers had a baby recently and expressed some anti-vaccination sentiments. My wife calmly told her that not only would she be putting her own kids in danger, but that she would be weaponizing her child against others. Quite a turnaround. Kind of boring, but I have a whack job grandmother who believes in all the pseudoscience health BS. Crystal healing, electromagnetic communications cause cancer, vaccines are bad, eat apricot pits to cure cancer, the whole 9 miles. When I was a kid, she tried to teach me all of this stuff like it was gospel, and I believed her because I was a kid, and why would my grandmom be wrong about something? Unfortunately for her, the minute I turned like 7, I got a huge hyperfixation on biology and quickly learned that all the stuff she spouted was utter BS. I'm autistic, and I was like the stereotypical autistic kid where they just know a fuck ton about one particular subject and devour any kind of learning material related to it they can get their hands on. I'm actually still like that, except now I can get a degree for it. It was not hard for me to realize that none of the things she believed made any sense, even as a kid. I got some Asperger's and I'm always consuming certain subjects like that. 11 years ago, I spent at least 2,000 hours studying the US Civil War. Quite an interesting subject. Then it was various economic and financial topics. More recently, woodworking. Now, pandemic related stuff. My ex-husband was a very controlling person and did not want our kids to get vaccines. I was always so scared knowing my kids had no protection. One day one of our kids scraped themselves on a fence and the school called me. I snapped and took them straight to an urgent care for a tetanus shot and just started secretly getting all my kids vaccines. We eventually divorced and now all my kids are fully caught up. Good for you. I have heard that it's really hard to get out of those situations. I was a stereotypical, naturalistic vegan type. Didn't believe in essential oils or crystal healing or anything. Just believed, mistakenly, that you couldn't beat nature and that vaccines were messing around with my baby's natural immunity growth. I believed they were an unnecessary risk. I knew my decision was controversial, so I kept it quiet. I wouldn't have been out campaigning or splashing it all over social media. It was a private decision. I held off until he was 2. We don't routinely vaccinate for chickenpox here in the UK, so he got it, which is expected. However, he got a bacterial infection on top and had to spend a night in hospital. Nothing too traumatic, but I realized I didn't have the balls to play nature v medicine anymore. I met my Mill, who is the ultimate anti-vaxxer, and realized how freaking crazy she sounds, and I didn't want to end up like that. Also, I have a baby daughter who I would like to live a long, healthy life. Not me, but my cousin. She was extremely anti-vax for most of her life, and she refused to vaccinate her kids when they were born. Her second baby caught whooping cough, passed it to her first kid, and they both almost died. According to her, nearly losing her kids made her realize that she was an idiot for not vaccinating them. My mom is anti-vax and I'm reminded every day of how annoying she is because she's also against vaccines for COVID-19 and thinks that the whole rule about wearing face masks is to move America to Islamic rule with women covering their faces and everything. She's also hugely Islamophobic, and long story short, I hate being home. That is quite the leap. I almost commend the creativity. She must be in excellent shape from all of those mental gymnastics. Not me, but my nonna. She's always been into oils, healing rocks, potatoes and socks, all that weird crap. When I was sick, she would give me a bath and run her hand right above my skin, from head to toe, to draw out the sickness. When my youngest cousin was born, she practically moved into my aunt's house and went everywhere with them. When she took him to get his shots, my nonna started fussing with the pediatrician and he just talked. All he did was explain crap to her, and she finally understood how batshit she sounded. She still firmly believes that my cat is gonna steal my firstborn's breath, but we're working on it. Your cat is gonna what? Well, after years of deluding myself into the belief that vaccines were evil, I finally hit the wall. I learned more about vaccines and why they were really necessary. I think it was my fear of the unknown that prevented me from seeing that science saves lives. I had a really good teacher in that regard and it ended up being a pretty great time in my life. I mean, on top of realizing that shots weren't bad things, I started getting an allowance and my 10th birthday party was freaking lit. Did not expect that ending, haha. Was it the needle that made vaccines seem evil, as I remember being scared of needles when I was a kid when I had my annual flu jab. I was caught into the anti-vax propaganda after my younger sister was said to have autism. Reddit helped me change my mind, with people providing evidence of anti-vaxxers' stupidity. What can I say except you're welcome? The research changed. I had my eldest shortly before Wakefield was debunked. When internet forums were way more common than Facebook and mommy blogs were all the rage, a la Julia and Julia. It was also about the time the CDC proactively began removing thoramine thimerosal from vaccines. Just in case. The pediatricians didn't fight me on it. I met and married my husband and he was pro-vaccine. Wakefield was multi-disproved and we stared at a delayed schedule. Then it came out that he was being paid for his results and he was developing a different measles vaccine. My next two were fully vaccinated on schedule. My mom and dad used to be anti-vaxxers until I was almost kicked out of the school I was accepted into for not having the required vaccinations. Back then this school was a really good school that was hard to get into, and my parents didn't want me to go to a normal school and so they started googling until eventually they found out it wasn't what they thought it was. They originally thought, and kind of still do, vaccines were just mercury mixed with a virus along with mind control chemicals. Literally had someone on Facebook tell me today that humans live too long as it is and that science shouldn't be trusted. Well, if you're gonna hold a controversial opinion, you might as well hold it for a reason somewhat based in reality. At least that person accepts that vaccines help people live. My mum's cousin and his wife converted to Catholicism and became anti-vax. Their children nearly died from diphtheria. They got them vaccinated after that. No, I'm not saying Catholicism is inherently anti-vax, just how it happened in their family. Not me, my wife. My wife is actually brilliant. One of the smartest people I know. Nobody would have ever guessed this about her. She was against vaccinations for our second because she was concerned that our first son ended up on the spectrum because of the vaccines he was given. It was all about fear of the unknown and control. Externally it was, I just want to be sure we are doing the best we can for him. Really it was, I'm afraid of making the wrong choice and I don't realize that inaction is a choice. She never said no vaccine, she said let's wait. I never relented. I had 2 points for my wife that kept coming up. 1. We have no reason to believe that vaccines cause autism. 2. I'd rather our kids be autistic than dead. The first one started with those exact words and basically never changed. The second one was a slow build up over time until I finally got to that exact wording. She cried. She realized that she felt the exact same way. She thanked me. All 3 of our kids gets vaccines at normal times except when a pediatrician who knows our medical situation suggests something different. Some people think vaccines cause autism. They are just bad at spelling. Vaccines cause adults. I grew up and realized my mom was wrong thanks to my now hubs convincing me. I got many vaccines in college and I'm doing just fine. My mom gave us some vaccines like the tetanus vac, but that's about it. I wasn't a particularly strong anti-vaxxer. As in, I never thought vaccines cause autism, or that big pharma does it to cripple people for life so they'll need their medications in the future etc. But did believe that natural immunity, as in gained from actually having a disease, is better than being in a developed country with access to clean water, great healthcare etc. meant that it wouldn't have been such a big deal etc. I had both measles and mumps as a kid. I clearly remember both and they weren't any worse than any other bad fever for me. I also of course ended up on various anti-vaxxer sites that cemented these beliefs. Why put such a little baby through an aggressive vaccination schedule etc. I was already doubting my view a bit since the more I hang out with anti-vaxxers the more absolute nonsense I heard, as a lot of them also believe in plenty other things. As an example, a close friend back then was adamant that commercial sun creams are terrible for you, so she proceeded to use just coconut oil on her and her 1-year son, and was dumbfounded when he got sunburned from being out for a few hours in the mild UK sun. Turning point was seeing a notice at my daughter's nursery daycare that there had been a case of measles. I was slightly worried, then reminded myself that I had it and it was fine if my daughter caught it, quickly followed by the thought of what if that notice said polio instead of measles, and I realized my hypocrisy. We don't have to worry about polio and other things like that precisely thanks to vaccines. And I'm also aware that just because I didn't have long-lasting effects doesn't mean that my kids wouldn't. Or what if one of my kids was immunocompromised and I would worry about even just taking them to the playground etc. I'm glad to report that both my kids are fully vaccinated, including flu vaccine every winter, and I'm quite outspoken about this. Wasn't as an anti-vaxxer. I'm mostly angry at the charlatans and crappy websites that cherry pick studies and twist the wording to make their point. And if you're sleep deprived parent, it's easy to not see this and believe it's true. Sorry for the essay. I had a phase in my early 20s where I hopped on the alternative everyone wants to secretly poison you train. Mostly because of some people that influenced me that time, and it's fascinating how easy you can slip into that mindset, mostly because it is indeed partly true. Like big pharma or other mostly money motivated people, companies do actually do a lot of crap that is not helping people but quite the opposite. But it's not like single doctors or scientists want that. They mostly want facts and the truth, and for people to gain knowledge and education with simple medical basics quickly made it clear to me that a lot of anti-vax and all the other crap people believe is either total nonsense or only a small part of the truth that ignored anything else from a medical standpoint. There is a reason why there are rules in place to determine if a study can be taken as meaningful, because if you only know part of the truth it's easy to mistake plain coincidence or correlation for causation. But I think with these hardcore conspiracy theorists it has nothing to do with facts or truth, it's about their mindset that anybody is out to get them. They are basically a constant victim to their own mentality. I was never anti-vaxxer, but I want to tell someone my story. I'm 14 right now. When I was little, I got some vaccines and I thought that it was enough. 2 years ago I looked into my documents and I realized that I didn't got like 15 vaccines. Then, I got mad at my mother, who always told me that I was vaccinated. She confessed that she also lied to my dad. We both were thinking I was safe. Luckily, after that my dad brought me to the doctor and now I'm fully vaccinated. Sorry for my bad English. Good for you for following up and getting all your vaccines. Terrible for your mom to lie and break your trust, but I don't think I would have known to do the same at 14. Coronavirus. I've never feared for my life before. This pandemic made me realize what it would have been like in the days of polio. You think that's bad? You should read The Demon and the Freezer, which is about anthrax and smallpox. I'm grateful we've eradicated smallpox. That stuff is straight up horrifying. I joined the military very young, 17, and immediately thrown into a gauntlet of vaccines. It had some adverse effects with some of us. Short-term, mild effects. Later, when being deployed overseas, I got another round along with what they called NARC, nerve agent antidote. The rumor mill and disinformation within my unit went in overdrive, basically suggesting that the NARC killed rats and not tested on humans, etc. etc. Basically, I hated and mistrusted the government and no one was going to stick that crap in my kid. Most of the medical community I interacted with were not the best at compassionately explaining the reality of the situation. I finally came across a really good pediatrician who treated his children and their parents like human beings, and he sat me down and spelled it all out in a way that did not belittle me. It's amazing how much better it works to calmly explain facts to someone and be as kind as possible versus telling them they're idiots, or screaming at them, or even just ignoring them. Some people won't change their mind even when presented with facts, but some will. You're the perfect example. Not me. My mom refused to get me vaccinated against HPV, mainly because the news were covering stories about people getting sick from it. I explained to her that even if the vaccine made me a little sick, that would still be better than potentially getting cervical cancer. I then got the vaccine. A friend wasn't completely anti-vax, but had her first kid vaccinated slowly because of the mercury and all. Someone finally pointed out that the nasty stuff was like the sodium and chlorine in table salt. Deadly poisons by themselves, but harmless as presented. She said she would never have questioned vaccines if that had been explained in more vaccine posters and such. Instead they were just the disease is worse than mercury, which implied the mercury was still in a poisonous form. I'll note her kid was fully vaccinated before starting school of any kind. I realized that other anti-vaxxers were also into other absolutely batshit ideas. Flat earth, young earth creationism, essential oils, and general anti-science nonsense. Fortunately, I realized this while my oldest was still a small baby and we quickly caught her up to schedule. I was brainwashed by people I trusted as a teen. It took realizing THST someone who believes chemtrails are a thing, or that some dude took animals and dinosaurs onto a huge boat while a deity flooded the entire earth may not be a completely stable person. Realizing that I had to build a mountain of conspiracy theories in order to justify believing that vaccines don't work in light of the overwhelming evidence that they do. For the record, I am not an anti-vaxxer, but I wanted to comment on another poster's story. As a child, I got most of the childhood diseases because they had yet to develop vaccines for them. We were among the first children to get a polio vaccine, for example. Many years later, when I enrolled at a public university, I was required to show proof that I was immunized against these diseases. Since I had contracted some of them, it was fairly certain that I was immune to them. But I never had mumps. They are unpleasant for children, but dangerous for adults. I had the titer test done and it turned out that even though I never caught them, I was exposed just enough to develop the antibodies. The other author found that he had no antibodies to any of the childhood diseases. My point is that through the randomness of exposure, some people never get sick but develop immunity anyway. This is not a reliable way to develop immunity, since exposure to a live virus can easily result in an active case of the disease. Typically, a vaccine uses a weakened or dead version of the pathogen just to give the immune system something to recognize and develop antibodies against. So it would appear that many people were vaccinated without a needle. They won that particular lottery if they never developed any symptoms. It wasn't just one thing, and it didn't happen all at once. I was passionately anti-vax as a teenager, simply because my parents were, I suppose. I wasn't vaccinated as a child and wrote essays for school about the evils of vaccination, but I was also very clever and good at math and science. I did a science degree focusing in physics and mathematics, and I became passionate about other things and lost my anti-vaccine fervor. And I discovered that instead of there being two sides, the big pharma dupes and the enlightened thinkers, there were more. There were anti-vaxxers. There were people, very smart ones, who had considered anti-vax arguments and found them unpersuasive. And I learned how incredibly freaking deadly measles is. And one day I realized that I'd completely changed my mind. I have friends that only changed their mind because it was mandatory to enroll their kids in a daycare when on a prolonged holiday. I don't understand people. You wouldn't take your new puppy outside without vaccinations. My dad used to talk at me for freaking hours about how vaccines were full of dangerous chemicals, how they caused autism, and how the government was using them as some kind of population control. He believes every word of it and so much more about other crazy crap. Then I googled what he told me. The 1,000 or so results dispelled his balls pretty quick. My daughter's severe dermatitis appeared right after her first vaccine. In retrospect, she already had mild symptoms before, but it took me a while to realize that. So when it was time for a new vaccine and her entire body was irritated, her pediatrician recommended to postpone vaccinations until she will see an improvement on her skin. For a while I was totally convinced that vaccines were bad and that side effects might be worse than the disease itself, so I was starting to consider refusing future vaccinations. For a new mom severely sleep deprived, being a part of a mom's group that's anti-vaxxers, anti-medication in general, holistic, pro-essential oils and all natural eco-bio-organic, sugar-free can be damaging AF. After a couple years and with my kid's skin condition getting better, I also got my brain back and could see things more logically. If you are new to the channel, you can subscribe. I publish new videos every day. Until then, check another video. Bye for now.